Chapter 28. She fled then. She ran from the clearing into the trees, numb with grief, half blind with tears. The rookstaff clutched before her in both hands like a shield. She raced through the shadows and half light of the island's early morning, oblivious to Killishan's distant rumble, to Morrowind's shudder in response, lost to everything but the need to escape the time and place of Garth's death. Even knowing she could never escape its memory, she tore past brush and limbs with heedless disregard, through tall grasses and brambles, along ridges of earth encrusted with lava rock, and over deadwood and scattered debris. She sensed none of it. It was not her body that fled, it was her mind. Garth. She called out to him endlessly, chasing after her memories of him, as if by catching one she might bring him back to life. She saw him race away, spectral, fatted and majoric. Parts of him appeared and faded in the air before her, blurred and distant images from times gone by. She saw herself give chase as she had so many times when they had played at being tracker and prey, when they had practiced the lessons of staying alive. She saw herself that last day in the turfing, before Cogline had appeared, and everything had changed forever. Skirting the shores of the Miriam, searching for signs, she watched them drop from the huge trees, huge, silent and quick. She felt him grapple for her, felt herself slip away, felt a long knife rise and descend. She heard herself laugh. "You're dead, Garth." And now, he really was. Somehow it was never entirely clear. She stumbled upon the others of the little company, the few who remained alive, Triss, the last of the elves, the last, besides herself, and Stresser and Fawn. She careened into them, spun away angrily as if they were hindrances, and kept going. They came after her, of course, running to catch up, calling out urgently, asking what was wrong, what had happened, where was Garth? "Gone," she said, head shaking. "Not coming." But it was okay. It was all right. He was safe now. Still running, she heard Triss demand again, "What is wrong?" And Stresser replied, "Sss, can't you see?" Words, whispered fugitively, passed between them, but she didn't catch their meaning, didn't care to. Fawn leapt from the pathway to her arm, clinging possessively, but she shook the tree twig off roughly. She didn't want to be touched. She could barely stand to be inside her own skin. She broke free of the trees. "Lady Wren!" she heard Triss cry out to her. Then she was scrambling up a lava slide, clawing and digging at the sharp rock, feeling it cut into her hands and knees. Her breath rasped heavily from her throat, and she was coughing, choking on words that wouldn't come. The rookstaff fell from her hands, and she abandoned it. She cast everything away, the whole of who and what she was, sickened by the thought of it, wanting only to flee, to escape, to run until there was nowhere left to go. When she collapsed finally, exhausted, stretched flat on the slide, sobbing uncontrollably, it was Triss who reached her first, who cradled her as if she were a child, who soothed her with the words and small touches and gave her a measure of the comfort she needed. He helped her to her feet, turned her about, and took her back down to the forest below. Carrying the rookstaff in one arm and supporting her with the other, he guided her through the morning hours like a shepherd, a stray lamb, asking nothing of her but that she place one foot before the other, and that she continue to walk with him. Stresser took the lead, his bulky form becoming point of reference on which she focused, the steadily changing object toward which she moved. First one foot, then the other, over and over again. Fawn returned for another try at scrambling up her leg and onto her arm, and this time she welcomed the intrusion. Pressing the tree squeak close, nuzzling back against the little creature's warmth and softness. They travelled all day like this, companions on a journey that required no words. The few times they paused to rest, Wren accepted the water Tris gave her to drink, and the fruit he pressed into her palm, and did not bother to ask where it came from, or if it was safe to eat. The daylight dimmed as clouds massed from horizon to horizon, as the fog thickened beneath. Kilishan stormed behind them. The eruptions unchecked now, fire and ash and smoke, spewing skyward in long geysers. The smell of sulphur thick in the air, the island shaking and rocking. When darkness finally descended, the crest of the mountain was bathed in a blood-red corona that flared anew with each eruption, and sent trailers of fire all down the distant slopes where the lava ran to the sea. Boulders grated and crunched as the molten rock carried them away, and trees burned with a sharp crackling despair. The wind died to nothing. A haze settled over everything, and the island became a fire-rimmed cage in which the inhabitants bumped up against one another in frightened, angry confusion. Stressa settled them that night in a cleft of rock that sheltered on all three sides, amid a grove of wiry ironwood, stripped all but bare of foliage. They huddled in the dark with their backs to the wall and watched the holocaust beyond grow brighter. They were still a day from the beaches, a day from any rendezvous with Tiger T, and the destruction of the island was imminent. Wren came back to herself enough to realise the danger they were in, sipping at the cup of water Tris gave her, listening to the sound of his voice as he continued to speak quietly, reassuringly. She remembered what it was that she was supposed to do, and that it was Tiger T alone who could help her do it. "Tris," she said finally, unexpectedly, seeing him for the first time, speaking his name in acknowledgement, making him smile in relief. Shortly after, the demons appeared. Morrowindl's shadow, and the first of those that had escaped Kilishan's fiery flow, fled down out of the hills toward the beaches, lost and confused, and ready to kill anything they came upon. They stumbled out of the fiery gloom, a ragged collection of misshapen horrors, and attacked unthinkingly, responding to instinct and to their own peculiar madness. Stressa heard them coming, sharp ears picking out the sound of their approach, and warned the others seconds before the attack. Sword drawn, Tris met the rush, withstood it, and very nearly turned it aside, almost a match for the things, even with only one useful arm. But the demons were crazed past fear or reason, driven from their high country by something beyond understanding. These humans were a lesser threat. They rallied and attacked anew, determined to exact some measure of revenge from the source at hand. But now Wren was facing them, consumed by her own madness, cold and reasoned, and she sent the magic of the Elfstone sifting into them like razors. Too late, they realized the danger. The magic caught them up, and they vanished in bursts of fire and sudden screams. In seconds, nothing remained but smoke and ash. Others came all during the night, small bunches of them, launching out of the darkness in frenzied rushes that carried them to quick and certain deaths. Wren destroyed them without feeling, without regret, and then burned the forest about until it was as fiery as the slopes above where the lava rivers steamed. As morning approached, the whole of their shelter for 50 yards out were barren and smoking. A charnel house of bodies, blackened beyond recognition, a graveyard in which only they survived. There was no sleep, no rest, and little respite against the assaults. Dawn found them hollow-eyed and staring, gaunt and ragged figures against the coming light. Tris was wounded in half a dozen new places, his clothing in rags, all of his weapons lost or broken, but his short sword. Wren's face was grey with ash, and her hands shook with the infusion of the Elfstone's power. Stressa's quills fanned out in every direction, and it did not seem as if they would ever settle back in place. Fawn crouched next to Wren like a coiled spring. As the light crept out of the east, silver sunrise through haze of fire and smoke, Wren told them finally what had become of Garth, needing at last to tell, anxious to rid herself of solitary burden she bore, the bitter knowledge that was hers alone. She told them quietly, softly, in silence that followed the last of the attacks. She cried again, thinking that perhaps she would never stop. But the tears were cleansing this time, as if finally washing away some of the hurt. They listened to her wordlessly. The captain of the home guard, the splinter scat, and the tree squeak gathered close so nothing would be missed. Even Fawn, who might or might not have understood her words, nestled against her shoulder. The words flowed from her easily, the dam of her despair and shame giving way, and a kind of peace settled deep within her. Wren, it was what was needed, Stressa told her solemnly when she had finished. You knew, didn't you? She asked in reply. Yes, I understood what the poison would do, but I could not tell you, Wren of the Elves, because you would not have wanted to believe. It had to come from him. And the splinter scat was right, of course, although it no longer really mattered. They talked a bit longer while the light seeped slowly past the gloom, brightening the world about them, the world of black ruin in which smoke still curled skyward in wispy spirals, and the earth still trembled with the fury of Kelashan's discontent. He gave his life for you, Lady Wren, Trist offered solemnly. He stood over you when the Westerun would have claimed you and fought to keep you safe. None of us would have fared as well. We tried, but only Garth had the strength. Keep that as your memory of him. But she could still feel herself pushing against the handle of the long knife as it slipped into his heart. Still feel his hands closing over hers, almost as if to absolve her of responsibility. She would always feel them there, she thought. She would always see what had been in his eyes. They started out again soon after, crossing the charred battleground of the night gone past to the fresh green landscape of the day that lay ahead, passing toward the last of the country that separated them from the beach. The tremors underfoot were constant still, and the fires of the lava rivers were burning closer, streaming down the mountainside above. Things fled about them in all directions, and even the demons did not pause to attack. Everything raced to escape the burning heat, driven by Kelashan's fury towards the shores of the Blue Divide. Morrowindl was turning slowly into a cauldron of fire, eating away at itself from the centre out. Cracks were beginning to appear everywhere, vast fissures that opened into blackness, that hiss and spit with steam and heat. The world that had flourished in the wake of the Elven's magic use was disappearing. And within days only the rocks and the ashes of the dead would remain. A new world was evolving about the little company as it fled, and when it was complete, nothing of the old would be left upon. They passed down into the meadows of tall grasses that bounded the final stretches of old growth, bordering the shoreline. The grasses had already begun to curl and die, smoke and steam by heat and gases, the life seared out of them. Shrub brush broke apart beneath their boots, dried and lifeless. Fires burned in hot spots and all about, and to their right, across a deep ravine, a thin ribbon of red fire worked its way relentlessly through a patchwork of wildflowers toward a stand of acacia that waited in waited in helpless, frozen anticipation. Clouds of black spot roiled down out of the heights of the Inju, where the jungle burned slowly to the waterline, the swamp beneath already beginning to boil. Rock and ash showered down from somewhere beyond their vision like hail out of clouds, thrown by the volcano's continuing explosions. The wind shifted, and it grew harder to see. It was midday, and the sky was as raw and grey and hazy as autumn twilight. Rin's head felt light and substanceless, a part of the air she breathed. Her bones were loose within her body, and the fire of the Elfstone's magic still flared and sparked like embers cooling. She searched the land about her and could not seem to focus. Everything drifted in the manner of clouds. "Stressor, how much farther?" she asked. "A ways," the splinter scat growled without turning. "Keep walking, Wren of the Alps." She did, knowing that her strength was failing and wandering absently, if it was from so much use of the magic or from exhaustion. She felt Triss move close, one arm coming about her shoulders. "Lean on me," he whispered, and took her weight against his own. The meadows passed away with the sweep of the sun some west. They reached the old grove. Already it was aflame to the south, the topmost branches burning, smoke bellowing. They pushed through rapidly, skidding and slipping on moss and leaves and loose rock. The trees were silent and empty. The pillars of a hall roofed in low-hanging clouds and mist. Growls and snarls rose up out of the haze, distant, but all about. The track wore on. Once something huge moved in the shadows off to one side, and Stressor wheeled to face it, spines lifting, but nothing appeared. And after a moment they moved on. The sound of water crashing against rocks sounded ahead, the rise and fall of the ocean. Wren found herself smiling, clasping the rook staff tight against her breast. There was still a chance for them, she thought wearily. There was still hope that might escape. Then finally, as daylight faded behind them and sunset brightened into silver and red ahead, they broke clear of the trees and found themselves staring out from a high bluff over the vast expanse of the Blue Divide. Smoke and ash clouded the air close at hand, but beyond its screen, the horizon was ablaze with colour. The company staggered forward and stopped. The bluff fell away sharply to a shoreline jagged with rocks. There were no beaches anywhere, and no sign of Tiger Tea. Wren leaned heavily on the staff, searching the sky. It stretched away, a vast and empty expanse. "Tiger Tea," she whispered in despair. Triss released her and moved away, searching the bluff. "Down there," he signalled after a moment, pointing north. "There's a beach, if we can get to it." But Stressor was already shaking his grizzled head. "We'll have to go back through the woods, back into the smoke and the things at height. Not a smart idea with darkness coming." Wren watched helplessly as the sun settled down against the ocean's edge and began to disappear. In minutes, it would be dark. They had come so far, she thought, and whispered, "No," so that only she could hear. She laid down the staff and slipped free the Elfstones. Holding them forth, she sent the white magic streaking across the sky from end to end, a flare of brightness against the grey twilight. The light shimmered like fire and disappeared. They all stood looking after it, watching the dark approach, watching the sun paint the sky with colour as it sank from view. Behind them the hunters began to gather. The demons come down from the heights, the black things either tracking them or drawn by the magic. Their shadows pushed against the edges of the twilight, growling, snarling, edging steadily closer. Wren and her companions were trapped on the bluff, caught against the drop into the ocean. Wren felt the rattle of her bones, of her breath, of her failing strength. It was too much to expect that Tiger T would be there for them after all this time. Too much to hope for. Yet she refused to let go of the only hope left to them. Once more she would use the magic if need be. Once more for good measure. Because there wasn't enough left in any case to keep them alive another night. There was not enough strength left in her to use it. Not enough left in any of them to matter. Tris stepped out to confront the shadows in the trees, lean and hard, broken arm hanging stiff, sword arm bent and ready. "Keep behind me," he ordered. The seconds slipped quickly away. The colours in the western sky faded into grey. Twilight deepened to a pale shade of ash. "There!" Stresser warned. Something launched itself out of the dark, a massive form, hammering into Tris, throwing him down. Another rushed in behind it, and Stresser showered it with quills. Ren swung the elfstones up and sent the magic streaking forth, burning the things closest. They screamed and hastily withdrew. Tris lay unconscious on the earth. Ren sagged to her knees, exhausted. "Stand up!" Stresser growled desperately. A handful of misshapen forms detached themselves anew and began to inch forward. "Stand up!" Then a shriek split the near silence, a sound like the tearing out of a human life, and a huge shadow swept the bluff. Claws raked the edges of the trees and sent the attackers scattering into the dark. Ren stared upward in disbelief, speechless. Had she seen? The shadow swung away, black wings knife-like against the sky, and another shriek emitted from its throat. "Spirit!" Ren screamed in recognition. Back swung the rock and plummeted to the bluff edge, where it settled with a mad beating of wings. A small warrior form leapt down, yelling and shouting wildly. "Ho! This way, quick! They won't stay frightened long!" Tiger T! And when Ren pulled Tris to his feet and staggered forward to meet the little man, she found the Tiger T she remembered from all those weeks ago, wrinkled and smiling within his brown skin. A scarecrow of bones and leather, rough hands ready and bright eyes quick. He looked at her, at her companions, at the rook staff she carried, and he laughed. "Rennie Lessedow," he greeted, "you are as good as your word, girl. Come back out of death to find me. Come back to spit in my face to prove you could do it after all. Shades, you must be tough as nails." She was too happy to see him, to disagree. He hurried them atop Spirit. Then, but only after a sharp glance at Stresser and a pointed warning to the splinter scat that he had best keep his quills to himself, muttering something about Ren's choice of travelling companions. He wrapped the splinter scat in a leather coverlet and boosted him up. Although Stresser remained still and compliant, his eyes darted anxiously. Ren bound Fawn to her back, mounted Spirit and pulled a semi-conscious Tris up in front of her where she could hold him in place. Her hands full, she jammed the rook staff between her legs in the harness. They worked swiftly. Tiger T and she, chased by the snarls and growls that rose from the darkness of the trees, driven by their fear of things hidden there. Twice black forms darted from the shadows as if to attack, but each time Spirit's angry shriek sent them scrambling away. It seemed to take them forever, but finally they were settled. With a quick last check of the harness straps, Tiger T sprang atop the rock. "Up now, child! Old bird!" he yelled urgently. With a final cry, Spirit spread his great wings and lifted away. A handful of demons broke cover, racing to catch them in a last desperate effort, flinging themselves across the bluff. Several caught hold of the rock's feathers, dragging the great bird down. But Spirit shook himself, twisted and raked wildly with his claws, and the attackers fell away into the dark. As the rock swept out over the blue divide and began to rise, Ren glanced back a final time. Morrowindl was a furnace, glowing against the night, all mist and steam and ash. Kilishan's mouth spitting out steams of molten rock, rivers of fire running to the sea. She closed her eyes and did not look back again. She was never sure how long they flew that night. It might have been hours, it might have been only minutes. She clung to Triss and the restraining straps as she fought to stay awake, exhausted to the point of senselessness. Fawn's arms were wrapped about her neck, warm and furry, and she could feel the tree squeak's worried breath against her neck. Somewhere behind, Shannara rode in silence. She heard Tiger T call back to her once or twice, but his words were lost in the wind, and she did not bother to try to answer. A vision of Morrowindl in those last minutes floated spectrally before her eyes, harsh and unyielding, a nightmare that would never recede into sleep. When they landed, whatever time had passed, it was still night, but the sky was clear and bright about her. Spirit settled down on a small atoll green with vegetation. The sweet smell of flowers wafted on the air. Wren breathed the scent gratefully as she slid down the rock's broad back, reaching up in numb response for Triss and then Shannara. Imagine, she thought dizzily, a moon and stars, a night bright with their light, no mist or haze, no fire. "This way, over here, girl," Tiger T advised gently, taking her arm. He led her to a patch of soft grass where she lay down and instantly fell asleep. The sun was red against the horizon when she woke again, a scarlet sphere rising from the ocean's crimson-coloured waters into skies black with thunderheads. The storm and its fire seemed settled in a single patch of earth and sky. She raised herself on her elbow and peered at the strange phenomenon, wondering how it could be. Then Tiger T, keeping watch at her side, whispered, "Go back to sleep, Miss Wren. It's still night. That's Morrowindl out there, all afire, burning up from the inside out. Kilishan's let go with everything. Won't be anything left soon, I'd guess." She did go back to sleep, and when she woke again it was midday, the sun sitting high in a cloudless blue expanse overhead, the air warm and fragrant, and the birdsong of a bright trillium against the rush of the ocean on the rocks. Fawn chittered from somewhere close by. She rose to look and found the tree squeak sitting on a rock and pulling on a vine so that it could nibble its leaves. Triss still slept. Shannara was nowhere to be seen. Spirit sat out at the edge of a cliff, his fierce eyes gazing out at the empty waters. Tiger T appeared from behind the bird and ambled over. He handed her a sack with fruit and bread and motioned her away from the sleeping Triss. She rose and they walked to sit in the shade of a palm. "Rested now?" he asked, and she nodded. "Eat some of this. You must be starved. You look as if you haven't eaten in days." She ate gratefully, then accepted the ale jug he offered and drank until she thought she would burst. Fawn turned to watch, eyes bright and curious. "You seem to have gathered up some new friends," Tiger T declared as she finished. "I know the elf and the splinter scat by name, but what's this one called?" "Her name is Fawn. She's a tree squeak." Wren's eyes locked on his. "Thanks for not leaving us, Tiger T. I was counting on you." "Ha!" he snorted, as if I would miss the chance of finding out how things had worked out. "But I admit, I had my doubts, girl. I thought your foolishness might have outstripped your fire. Looks like it almost did." She nodded. "Almost. I came back looking for you every day after the volcano blew. Saw it erupt 20 miles out. I said to myself, she's got something to do with that. You mark me. And you did. Didn't you?" He grinned, face crinkling like old leather. "Anyway, we circled about once a day, Spirit and me, searching for you. Had just finished last night's swing when we saw your light. Might have left otherwise. How did you do that, anyway? He pursed his lips, then shrugged. No. Hold off. Don't tell me. That's the land elf magic at work. Or I miss my guess. It's better I don't know. He paused. In any case, I'm very glad you're safe. She smiled in acknowledgement, and they sat silently for a moment, looking at the ground. Fishing birds swooped and dove across the open waters like white arrows, wings cocked back and long necks extended. Fawn came down from her perch to crawl up Wren's arm and burrow into her shoulder. I guess your big friend didn't make it, Tiger T said finally. Garth. The pain of the memory brought tears to her eyes. She shook her head. No, he didn't. I'm sorry. I think maybe you'll feel his loss a long time, won't you? The shrewd eyes slid away. Some kinds of pain don't heal easily. She didn't speak. She was thinking of her grandmother and of Iowan, of the owl and Gavilan Elesadel, of Court and Dahl, all lost in the struggle to escape Morrowindl, all a part of the pain she carried with her. She stared out over the water into the distance, searching the skyline. She found what she was searching for finally, a dark smudge against the horizon where Morrowind burned slowly to ash and rock. And what of the elves? Tiger T asked. You found them? I guess, judging from the fact that one of them came with you. She looked back at him again, surprised by the question, forgetting momentarily that he had not been with her. Yes, I found them. And Arbelon? Arbelon as well, Tiger T. He stared at her a moment, then shook his head. They wouldn't listen, would they? They wouldn't leave. He announced it matter-of-factly, undisguised bitterness in his voice. Now they're all gone. Lost. The whole of them. Nah, foolish people. Foolish indeed, she thought, but not lost. Not yet. She tried to tell Tiger T about the Loden, tried to find the words, but she couldn't. It was too hard to speak of any of it just now. She was still too close to the nightmare she had left behind, still floundering through the harsh emotions that even the barest thought of it invoked. Whenever she brought the memories out again, she felt as if her skin was being flayed from her body. She felt as if fire was searing her, burning down to her bones. The elves, victims of their own misguided belief in the power of the magic, how much of that belief had been bequeathed to her. She shuddered at the thought. There were truths to be weighed and measured, motives to be examined, and lives to be set right. Not the least of those belonged to her. Tiger T, she said quietly. The elves are here, with me. I carry them. She hesitated as he stared at her expectantly. I carry them in my heart. Confusion lined his brow, his eyes lowered, searching her empty hands. The problem is deciding whether they belong. He shook his head and frowned. You're not making any sense. Not to me. She smiled. Only to myself. Be patient with me a while, would you? No more questions. But when we get to where we're going, we'll find out together whether the lessons of Morrowind have taught the elves anything. Triss awoke then, stirring sluggishly from his sleep, and they rose to tend him. As they worked, Wren's thoughts took flight. Like a practiced juggler, she found herself balancing the demands of the present against the needs of the past, the lives of the elves against the dangers of their magic, the belief she had lost against the truth she had found, silent in her deliberation, her concentration complete. She moved among her companions as if she were there with them, when in fact she was back on Morrowind, watching the horror of its magic-induced evolution, discovering the dark secrets of its makers, reconstructing bits and pieces of the frantic, terrifying days of her struggle to fulfill the charges that had been given her. Time froze, and while it stood statue-like before her, carved out of a chilling, silent introspection, she was able to cast away the last of the tattered robes that had been her old life, the innocence of being that had preceded Cogline and Elenon, and a journey to her past, and to don at last the mantle of hope and what she now realized had always been meant to be. Goodbye, Ren, that was. Fawn squirmed against her shoulder, begging for attention. She spared what little she could. An hour later, Splinter Scat, Tree Squeak, captain of the Elven Home Guard, Wing Rider and the girl who had become the queen of the elves, were winging their way eastward atop Spirit toward the Four Lands.